The first thing Samuel Whitmore noticed when he woke on the morning of December 3rd, 1837, was that he wasn't cold. This was wrong. Everything about a Montana winter morning should be cold. Your breath should fog in the air. Your muscles should be stiff. The tip of your nose should ache. But Samuel was warm, genuinely warm, lying in his bunk while the wind screamed outside at 40 below zero. 300 yards away, in a standard trapper's cabin, Jacob Hendricks was already awake because he couldn't sleep. He'd been awake most of the night, actually, huddled under every blanket he owned, feeding the fire every hour, shivering despite his best efforts. His feet felt like blocks of ice. His back ached from tension. When he finally gave up on sleep and stepped outside to relieve himself, the cold hit him like a physical blow. He looked across the snow-covered clearing toward Samuel's cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and lazy, not the thick, desperate smoke of a fire being fed constantly to fight the cold. Just a normal, modest column of smoke. Jacob shook his head. That fool Whitmore and his crazy coal bed probably froze to death in the night, and the fire was just burning down. Samuel Whitmore was very much alive. He was also warm enough to sleep through the night without waking once to tend the fire. This was unheard of. Impossible, according to every other trapper in the Bitterroot Valley. And it was all because of the system they'd mocked him for building, the system he'd spent an entire month constructing while everyone else was out running their trap lines. The carbon coal bed they'd called a waste of time, a fool's project, the desperate invention of a man too weak for mountain life. They weren't laughing anymore. At least the ones who'd survived the winter weren't laughing. Some had already left, packed up in November, when they realized their cabins wouldn't keep them alive. Others had died, frozen in their bunks, despite the fires burning just feet away. And a few, a very few, had swallowed their pride and come to Samuel to ask how he'd done it, how he'd built a bed that kept a man warm all night in temperatures that killed. The story of Samuel Whitmore's carbon coal bed starts earlier that year, in the summer of 1837, when he'd first arrived in the Bitterroot Valley. He was 29 years old, a former blacksmith from Pennsylvania who joined a trapping brigade heading west. Unlike most young men drawn to the fur trade by dreams of adventure and wealth, Samuel had a more practical motivation. He was dying. At least, that's what the doctor in Philadelphia had told him. Consumption, tuberculosis, the White Plague. Whatever name you used, the diagnosis was the same. His lungs were failing. He had perhaps 2 years, maybe 3 if he was lucky. The doctor recommended a warm, dry climate, Arizona Territory perhaps, Southern California. Somewhere the cold and damp wouldn't accelerate his decline. Samuel had listened politely, thanked the doctor, and promptly headed for the Rocky Mountains. His reasoning was simple. If he was going to die anyway, he'd rather die in country worth seeing. He'd rather spend his last years in the wilderness than wasting away in some sunny desert town. And besides, he'd heard stories about the mountain air, how clean it was, how some men with lung troubles actually improved after years at high altitude. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only hope he had. The journey west was hard, but manageable. The trapping brigade moved slowly, taking 4 months to reach the Bitterroot Valley. Samuel worked as the company's blacksmith and general repairman, fixing traps, shoeing horses, mending tools. His skills made him valuable, which meant he was well fed and looked after. By the time they reached Montana Territory, he was actually feeling better. His cough had lessened. He could take deeper breaths. When the brigade captain decided to establish a winter camp in the Bitterroot Valley, Samuel filed a claim on a piece of land near the creek and decided to stay. He'd build a cabin, run a small trap line, and see if he could make it through the winter. If his lungs gave out, well, at least he'd die in beautiful country. If he survived, he'd prove the Philadelphia doctor wrong and have a future in the mountains. The other trappers in the valley were a mixed group. Some were veterans of 20 years in the Rockies, leather-faced men who'd seen everything and survived it all. Others were greenhorns like Samuel, learning as they went. Everyone built their cabins using the standard method. Single wall construction, chinked logs, stone fireplace, sod roof. Fast, cheap, adequate for most winters. Samuel built his cabin the same way. He didn't know any better, and the veterans assured him this design would keep him alive. But Samuel had one advantage over the other trappers. He understood heat, really understood it. Years of working as a blacksmith had taught him how heat moved, how different materials absorbed and released thermal energy, how to create and maintain specific temperatures for different metalworking tasks. This knowledge, combined with his experience of nearly freezing to death during his first week in the completed cabin, led him to a realization. The standard cabin design was fundamentally flawed. It focused all the heating effort on warming the air in the cabin. The fireplace burned wood, heating the air, which then rose toward the ceiling and leaked out through gaps in the construction. Meanwhile, the occupant lay on a bed that was essentially a wooden platform suspended over a frozen floor with frozen ground just inches below. The heat rose. The cold radiated up from below, and the person in the middle fought a losing battle to stay warm. Samuel had spent enough nights shivering in his bunk to understand the problem viscerally. The fire could roar all night. The cabin air could be tolerably warm, but his bed stayed cold. The wood platform conducted cold from the floor. The buffalo robe beneath him compressed under his weight, losing its insulating properties, and the blankets above him, no matter how many he piled on, couldn't compensate for the cold radiating up from below. He needed to heat the bed itself, not just the air around it. This thought led him down an unusual path. In his blacksmith shop back in Pennsylvania, Samuel had used a technique for keeping metal stock warm overnight. Instead of maintaining a fire all night, which required constant attention and used enormous amounts of fuel, he would bank coals in a special pit lined with fire brick. The coals would burn slowly, radiating heat for hours. In the morning, the metal stock stored near the pit would still be warm, making it easier to work. Could the same principle be applied to a bed? Could he create a thermal mass beneath his sleeping platform that would radiate heat upward for hours? The idea seemed sound. In theory, the execution would be complicated. It would require significant work, and he had no idea if it would actually function in the extreme cold of a Montana winter. But Samuel was a man with limited time and nothing to lose. If it didn't work, he'd tear it out and try something else. If it did work, he might actually survive the winter without burning himself into poverty on firewood. He began in late August, when everyone else was busy running their trap lines and preparing meat for winter. First, he carefully disassembled the sleeping platform in his cabin. Then he began digging. The Montana ground was hard, full of rocks, and digging was brutal work. Samuel's lungs protested, forcing him to stop frequently to catch his breath, but he persisted, removing soil and rock to create a pit approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet deep, exactly where his bed would sit. The other trappers noticed. How could they not? Samuel was spending his daylight hours digging a hole in his cabin floor while they were out checking traps. Jacob Hendricks stopped by one afternoon to see what was happening. "You putting in a root cellar?" he asked, peering at the pit. "Something like that," Samuel replied, not wanting to explain the full plan until he knew it would work. "Seems like you'd want it under the cabin, not inside it," Jacob observed. "Saves digging through the floor when you need to access it in winter." "This is more convenient," Samuel said, continuing to work. Jacob shook his head and left. The story spread through the valley. That Pennsylvania blacksmith was digging up his cabin floor, probably had some fool notion from back east that didn't apply to mountain living. Once the pit was complete, Samuel began the next phase, lining it. He needed material that would absorb heat, hold it for hours, and release it slowly. Stone was the obvious choice. He spent a week hauling river rocks, selecting flat pieces that could be stacked efficiently. The bottom of the pit received a layer of sand for leveling, then a carefully arranged layer of flat stones. Then another layer, then another. He built up a stone mass about 8 inches thick, covering the entire bottom of the pit. The walls of the pit were lined with stone as well, creating a thermal battery that would absorb heat and radiate it upward. But stone alone wasn't enough. Samuel needed a heat source that would last all night without requiring attention. This is where his blacksmithing knowledge became crucial. In the forge, he'd learned that different types of coal and charcoal burned at different rates and temperatures. Hardwood charcoal burned hot, but fast. Soft coal burned cooler, but longer. Anthracite coal, if you could get it, burned slowly with intense heat and very little smoke. But Montana Territory in 1837 didn't have anthracite coal readily available. What it did have was wood, lots of wood, and wood could be converted into charcoal, which could then be used to create a long-lasting, clean-burning heat source. Samuel built a small charcoal kiln behind his cabin. It was a simple mound kiln constructed by stacking wood in a specific pattern, covering it with soil, and then lighting it through small vents. The wood would burn in a low-oxygen environment, converting to charcoal over several days. The process was labor-intensive and required constant monitoring, but it produced high-quality hardwood charcoal. While the charcoal was being made, Samuel continued working on the bed system. He constructed a metal grate that would sit in the pit, elevated about 4 inches above the stone base. This grate was made from scraps of iron he'd salvaged from broken traps and tools welded together in his small forge. The grate would hold the charcoal, allowing air to circulate beneath it for efficient burning while preventing the coals from directly contacting the stone thermal mass. Above the grate, Samuel built another platform. This one was made from flat stones arranged to create an air gap of about 6 inches above the charcoal grate. The air gap was critical. It would prevent the sleeping platform from getting dangerously hot while still allowing radiant heat to rise. The sides of this upper stone platform were sealed with clay, creating channels that would direct the heat upward while preventing sparks or embers from escaping. On top of the stone platform, Samuel laid thick wooden planks. These would support his actual sleeping surface while being insulated from direct contact with the hot stones below. Then came the sleeping surface itself. Several inches of sand for thermal mass and cushioning, covered with buffalo robes, wool blankets, and finally his regular bedding. By the time he was finished, his sleeping platform stood about 18 inches higher than the original cabin floor. The entire system, from the bottom of the pit to the top of the sleeping surface, was nearly 4 feet of carefully engineered thermal management. It had taken him 6 weeks to build, 6 weeks of work while everyone else was preparing for winter in conventional ways. The mockery had started early and only intensified as the project dragged on. "Whitmore's building a throne in there," one trapper joked. "Gonna be the king of the frozen north?" "More like a funeral pyre," another commented. "He'll burn his cabin down around himself." "Waste of time," Jacob Hendricks said repeatedly. "All that work for what? A bed that sits high off the ground. He'll hit his head on the ceiling every morning." The criticism bothered Samuel less than the concern. The concern was worse because it was well-intentioned. The older trappers, the veterans who'd survived multiple mountain winters, would stop by to offer advice. "Son, I know you've got some ideas from back east, but out here, we do things a certain way because that way works. You're spending time and effort on something that won't help you survive. You need to be cutting firewood, preserving meat, preparing for the cold, not digging holes and building elaborate bed frames." Samuel listened politely, thanked them for their concern, and kept working. He knew he looked foolish. He knew his reasoning seemed unsound to men who'd survived using traditional methods. But he also knew his own body. He knew the cold was his enemy in a way it wasn't for healthy men. A normal person might be uncomfortable in a freezing cabin. Samuel's damaged lungs could kill him. He needed every advantage he could create. By mid-October, the system was complete and ready to test. Samuel had stockpiled several large baskets of hardwood charcoal. He'd created a long-handled shovel specifically for placing hot coals into the pit through a small access door he'd built into the side. He'd installed a thin metal chimney that vented from the coal bed to the outside, preventing any smoke or carbon monoxide from entering the cabin. The system was as safe as he could make it, as efficient as his knowledge allowed, and completely untested. The first test came on October 23rd, when the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that season. Samuel built a fire in his regular fireplace and let it burn down to coals. Then, using his long-handled shovel, he carefully transferred hot coals into the charcoal bed through the access door. He spread them across the grate, then added a layer of fresh hardwood charcoal on top. The charcoal would burn slowly, heating the stone thermal mass beneath and around it. Samuel closed the access door, adjusted the vent to allow just enough air for combustion, and waited. Within an hour he could feel warmth radiating from the sleeping platform. Not intense heat, but a gentle, steady warmth. He placed his hand on the surface. Warm to the touch, but not uncomfortably hot. Perfect. That night he went to bed with the regular fireplace burning low. The cabin air was cool, probably around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. But his bed was warm. The heat radiated up through the layers of stone, sand, and buffalo robes, creating a cocoon of warmth. Samuel slept better than he had since arriving in Montana. When he woke in the morning, the cabin was cold. The fire had gone out hours ago, but his bed was still warm, not as warm as the night before, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding air. The thermal mass had held heat through the night, exactly as he'd hoped. The system worked. Samuel refined the technique over the next several weeks. He experimented with different amounts of charcoal, different venting configurations, different timing for loading the coals. He discovered that loading the coal bed about 2 hours before bedtime gave the thermal mass time to heat up fully. He found that a half basket of charcoal would provide warmth for 8 to 10 hours, gradually declining but never fully cooling. He learned to bank the charcoal at night, reducing the airflow so it would burn even more slowly, extending the heat into the morning hours. By early November, Samuel had the system perfected. He could maintain a warm sleeping surface all night, every night, using about a quarter of the firewood he'd been burning previously. His cabin's main fireplace now only needed to be lit in the evening for cooking and to create the coals for the bed. It could die out overnight without issue. The contrast with other trappers became stark as winter deepened. Jakob Hendricks, in his standard cabin, was burning 4 to 5 logs per night just to keep from freezing. He woke multiple times to feed the fire. His sleep was fragmented and unsatisfying. Samuel, meanwhile, slept through the night in his warm bed, woke rested, and used a fraction of the firewood. The word spread slowly. Some trappers were curious and stopped by to see the system. Samuel showed them how it worked, explained the principles, offered to help them build similar systems. Most declined. Too much work, they said, too complicated. Their cabins were already built, maybe next year if they came back. A few were interested, but skeptical. How do you know it won't burn your cabin down? They asked. The coals are contained in a metal grate, surrounded by stone, with proper venting. There's no way for fire to reach the wood structure, Samuel explained. And what about the smoke, the poisonous air from burning coal? That's why there's a dedicated vent pipe. Everything exhausts outside. I wake up clear-headed every morning. Seems like a lot of risk for a warm bed. Samuel shrugged. I'd rather risk a fire than guarantee freezing to death. November turned to December. The real cold arrived. Temperatures that dropped to 20 below, then 30 below, then deeper. The kind of cold that made the trees crack and pop in the night. The kind of cold that froze a man's breath in his beard, the kind of cold that killed. The trappers' cabins became survival shelters. Men spent most of their time inside, venturing out only to collect firewood, check essential traps, or perform unavoidable tasks. They burned through their wood supplies at alarming rates. Sleep became difficult. The cold was relentless, seeping through every gap, radiating from every surface. This is where you should stop and ask yourself, have I subscribed to this channel yet? If not, hit that subscribe button now. We are diving deep into forgotten survival knowledge that could save your life, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Jakob Hendricks reached his breaking point in mid-December. He'd been awake most of 3 consecutive nights, unable to sleep despite burning fire after fire. His wood supply was half gone, and winter was only beginning. His body ached from cold and fatigue. He'd developed a rattling cough that wouldn't go away. On the morning of December 15th, he trudged through knee-deep snow to Samuel's cabin and knocked on the door. Samuel answered, looking rested and healthy. "Jakob," he said, surprised. "Come in." "I need help," Jakob said simply. "I can't keep doing what I'm doing. I'll be dead by January." Samuel stepped aside to let him in. The cabin was cool, but not freezing. The fireplace held only ash from the previous evening. But when Jakob absently sat on the edge of Samuel's sleeping platform while they talked, he felt the warmth radiating from it. Real warmth. He stood up and pressed his hand against the surface, still warm, hours after Samuel had woken. "This is what you've been trying to tell us about," Jakob said quietly. "Yes." "I mocked you. Called you a fool." "You did. I was wrong. You were following the wisdom of experienced men. That's not foolish." Jacob looked around the cabin, seeing it differently now. The raised sleeping platform, the small access door in the side, the thin vent pipe running to the exterior wall. "Will you teach me how to build this?" he asked. "Of course," Samuel replied. Over the next week, Samuel helped Jacob retrofit his existing cabin. They couldn't dig as deep or build as elaborate a system as Samuel's, but they created a modified version. A smaller thermal mass, a simpler charcoal grate, a basic venting system. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Jakob slept through his first full night in weeks, waking warm and rested. The transformation was immediate and obvious. Other trappers noticed. When a man who'd been haggard and exhausted suddenly looked healthy and rested, people asked questions. Jakob told them about the coal bed, how it worked, how much difference it made, how he'd been a fool to resist it for so long. 3 more trappers asked Samuel for help. He assisted them all, adapting the design to fit their cabins and circumstances. One built a permanent installation like Samuel's. Another created a portable metal box version that could be moved. The third built a communal warming platform in the center of his cabin that could serve as both a bed and a sitting area. Not everyone was convinced. Some trappers remained skeptical, believing that their traditional methods were sufficient. They viewed the coal bed as overcomplicated, unnecessary, possibly dangerous. They continued burning massive amounts of firewood and sleeping poorly. Then came the Christmas storm. It hit on December 24th, 1837. A blizzard that would later be recorded as one of the worst in Montana territorial history. The temperature dropped to 43 degrees below zero. The wind screamed at 50 miles per hour. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to zero. The storm lasted 4 days. During those 4 days, survival became the only concern. Fires had to be maintained constantly. Doors had to be kept clear of drifting snow. Firewood had to be brought in from storage, a dangerous journey of even just a few yards in whiteout conditions with killing wind. Samuel and the trappers who'd built coal beds weathered the storm with relative calm. They could sleep warm, even when they let their main fires die down to conserve firewood. They could rest, staying strong and alert. Those without coal beds suffered terribly. Constant fire tending meant no real sleep for days. The cold penetrated even well-built cabins when the wind was that fierce. Men burned through their entire wood supplies and had to venture out in the storm to get more, risking death with every trip. When the storm finally broke on December 28th, 3 trappers in the Bitterroot Valley were dead. 2 had frozen in their cabins despite having fires. They'd simply exhausted themselves, fighting the cold, fallen asleep, and never woken up. The 3rd had died attempting to reach a neighbor's cabin when his own firewood ran out. His body was found 300 yards from safety, frozen solid in a snowdrift. Samuel led the burial party. They couldn't dig proper graves in the frozen ground, so they built a cairn of stones over the wrapped bodies, promising to do a proper burial in spring. As they worked, Jacob said quietly, they'd be alive if they'd built coal beds. Samuel didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, maybe. We can't know for sure, but it would have given them better odds. The deaths changed everything. Suddenly, Samuel's fool's system wasn't funny anymore. It was survival technology. Every remaining trapper in the valley either already had a coal bed or was building one. Those who had been most vocal in their mockery were now the most eager to learn. Samuel spent the rest of January helping men retrofit their cabins, sharing his knowledge freely. He never mentioned the mockery, never said, "I told you so," never made anyone feel worse than they already did about their earlier skepticism. He just helped. The variations that emerged were creative. One trapper built a dual-purpose system that heated both his bed and a stone bench for sitting during the day. Another created a coal vault, a heavily insulated box of coals that could be carried between his cabin and a small outbuilding, providing portable heat. A third built multiple small coal beds in different areas of his cabin, creating zones of warmth. The underlying principle was always the same. Heat a thermal mass with long-burning coals, let it radiate warmth for hours, use far less fuel than constant fire tending required. Simple in concept, revolutionary in impact. By February, the Bitterroot Valley trapping community had been transformed. Men were sleeping better, burning less wood, and surviving the winter with less suffering than any previous year. The knowledge spread beyond the valley. Trappers who came through carried stories of the coal bed system. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others paid attention and tried it themselves. Samuel's health had improved remarkably, whether it was the mountain air, the better sleep, or simply the reduction in cold stress. His lungs were functioning better than they had in years. His cough had nearly disappeared. He could breathe deeply without pain. The Philadelphia doctor's death sentence seemed increasingly uncertain. In March, as winter began loosening its grip, a visitor arrived in the valley. His name was Robert Fraser, a Scottish trapper who had spent 15 years in the Canadian Rockies. He'd heard stories about the coal bed system and had traveled specifically to see it. Samuel showed him the installation, explained the principles, answered questions. Fraser examined everything carefully, occasionally nodding or making notes in a small journal. Finally, he said, "This is brilliant, simple, but brilliant. Have you considered the implications beyond just sleeping?" "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. "Heating efficiency," Fraser explained. "You've discovered a way to store heat that has applications beyond beds, greenhouses for extending the growing season, root cellars that stay above freezing without active heating, workshops that stay warm enough for delicate tasks. You've solved a fundamental problem. How to maintain warmth without constant fuel consumption. That's valuable knowledge." Samuel hadn't thought of it in those terms. He'd just been trying not to freeze. But Fraser was right. The principle could be applied broadly. Over the next several weeks, Samuel and Fraser experimented with variations. They built a small greenhouse with a coal bed thermal mass beneath the soil. Even in March cold, the greenhouse stayed warm enough to sprout seeds. They retrofitted a root cellar with a modest thermal mass system, keeping it above freezing without risk of fire. They even created a heated workbench in Samuel's smithy, allowing him to keep his hands warm while doing detailed metalwork. Each application proved the versatility of the concept. Fraser documented everything, promising to share the knowledge through his network of trappers and traders. "This is too valuable to keep secret," he said. "Every man in the mountains should know this." "I've never tried to keep it secret," Samuel replied. "I'll teach anyone who asks." "I know. That's what makes you different. Most men would hoard this, try to profit from it. You're just giving it away." Samuel shrugged. "What good is surviving if everyone around you dies? We're stronger when we all have the knowledge." Spring arrived in April. The snow melted. The creeks ran high with runoff. The trappers who'd survived the winter began preparing for the summer season. Several decided not to return the following year. The mountain life had proven too hard. But those who stayed had learned valuable lessons. The most important lesson was this: conventional wisdom isn't always correct. Just because something has been done a certain way for years doesn't mean it's the best way. Innovation matters. Adaptation matters. Being willing to try new approaches even when others mock you can mean the difference between life and death. The coal bed system became standard in the Bitterroot Valley. New trappers arriving in the region were taught to build it as part of their basic winter preparation. The design continued to evolve. Someone added a damper system that allowed more precise control of burn rate. Another trapper discovered that mixing charcoal with specific types of low-smoke coal extended the burn time even further. A third innovated a tile-based system that distributed heat more evenly. Each improvement was shared freely. The community grew stronger as the knowledge spread. Samuel Whitmore stayed in the Bitterroot Valley for another 30 years. He never returned east. His consumption, which should have killed him within 2 years, simply never progressed. Whether the mountain air cured him, or the doctors had been wrong, or he'd simply outlasted the disease through sheer stubbornness, no one could say. He lived to the age of 59, dying not from his lungs but from a horse accident in 1867. His cabin with its coal bed system stood until 1892, when it was finally dismantled. The stones from his thermal mass were used to build a memorial marker at the Valley Cemetery. People who never met Samuel Whitmore used his system for decades after his death. The principle he'd pioneered, heating a thermal mass with slow-burning fuel to create long-lasting radiant warmth, eventually influenced the design of masonry heaters, heated floors, and other efficient heating systems. Engineers and architects rediscovered the concept multiple times, often not knowing they were following in the footsteps of a Pennsylvania blacksmith who just wanted to sleep warm. The mockery Samuel endured in the autumn of 1837 was real and stinging, but it taught an important lesson about innovation. New ideas always face resistance. People are comfortable with the known, suspicious of the unknown. The person proposing change will be called a fool until the moment they're proven right. Then suddenly, everyone claims they knew it was a good idea all along. Samuel's response to the mockery was instructive. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince skeptics with words. He simply built his system, proved it worked, and helped anyone who wanted to learn. Results speak louder than arguments. Demonstration beats persuasion. If you believe in something strongly enough, build it and let the results defend themselves. The deaths that occurred during the Christmas storm were tragedy, but they drove home an important survival principle. Adequate preparation isn't enough in extreme conditions. You need excellent preparation. The difference between a cabin that mostly keeps you warm and one that fully protects you can be the difference between life and death when the truly hard times come. The trappers who died weren't stupid or unprepared by normal standards. They had cabins, firewood, supplies. They'd done what experienced men told them was sufficient. But sufficient for an average winter isn't sufficient for the worst winter. Building for the average case leaves you vulnerable to the extreme case. And it's the extreme cases that kill. This lesson extends far beyond 1830s Montana. It applies to any situation where the stakes are high and the conditions unpredictable. Financial preparation, emergency supplies, backup systems. Redundancy in critical infrastructure. The principle remains the same: hope for the average, prepare for the extreme. The community response to the storm deaths was equally instructive. Once the threat became undeniable, adoption of the coal bed system was rapid and complete. People are capable of changing their minds when confronted with compelling evidence. The key is making the evidence undeniable. Samuel didn't need to say, "I told you so." The survival rate spoke for itself. This brings us to another important point about survival knowledge. It often comes from unexpected sources. The veterans, the men with 20 years of mountain experience, were using traditional methods because those methods had kept them alive. But they'd also been lucky enough to avoid the worst extremes. Samuel, the newcomer with weak lungs and an engineering background, brought a fresh perspective and specific knowledge that led to a breakthrough. Never dismiss ideas because they come from inexperienced people. Never assume that tradition has all the answers. The best solutions often come from combining traditional wisdom with new thinking. Before we continue, let me ask you something. Are you getting value from this story? If so, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Hit that bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into forgotten survival knowledge. We are bringing these lost techniques back to life, and your support helps us keep going. The technical aspects of Samuel's coal bed are worth examining in detail because they reveal sophisticated understanding of heat transfer. First, the thermal mass. Stone was the perfect choice. It has high specific heat capacity, meaning it can absorb a lot of thermal energy without getting excessively hot. It releases that heat slowly over many hours. The 8 inches of stone base provided enough mass to store significant thermal energy from the burning charcoal. Too little mass wouldn't store enough heat. Too much mass would take too long to heat up and would be unnecessarily heavy. Samuel's dimensions were nearly optimal for a single-person bed. Second, the air gaps. The space beneath the charcoal grate allowed oxygen to reach the coals for combustion. Too little air and the coals would smother. Too much air and they'd burn too fast. The adjustable vent let Samuel fine-tune the burn rate. The air gap above the grate, between the coals and the upper stone platform, prevented the sleeping surface from getting dangerously hot. It allowed radiant heat to pass through while blocking direct conduction. The result was a sleeping surface that stayed warm but never uncomfortably hot, a difficult balance to achieve. Third, the venting system. Burning charcoal produces carbon monoxide, a deadly odorless gas. Samuel's dedicated vent pipe, running from the coal bed directly to the outside, prevented any accumulation of dangerous gases in the cabin. This was a critical safety feature that some of the later, less careful implementations omitted, sometimes with fatal results. Proper venting wasn't optional, it was essential. Fourth, the charcoal selection. Samuel used hardwood charcoal, which burns cleaner and longer than softwood charcoal. He avoided coal when possible because it produced more smoke and had a stronger odor. The quality of the fuel directly affected the system's performance. Poor quality charcoal meant shorter burn times and more frequent reloading. Fifth, the insulation layers. The sand, buffalo robes, and blankets above the wooden platform served multiple purposes. They cushioned the sleeping surface, but more importantly, they trapped air and prevented too rapid heat loss upward. Without adequate insulation, the heat would rise into the cabin air and be wasted. With proper insulation, it was directed to warm the sleeper. Every element of the system had a purpose. Nothing was arbitrary. This level of engineering thought, applied by a self-taught blacksmith in an 1830s mountain cabin, was remarkable. It demonstrated that innovation doesn't require formal education or advanced resources. It requires careful observation, logical thinking, and willingness to experiment. The fuel efficiency of the coal bed system was revolutionary for its time and context. A typical mountain cabin in a Montana winter might burn through 5 to 7 cords of wood per season. A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long. That's 128 cubic feet of wood. Cutting, splitting, and stacking that much wood was weeks of dangerous, exhausting labor. Samuel's cabin, with the coal bed system, used approximately 2 cords of wood for the entire winter. The difference was that most of his wood went into charcoal production, which was much more efficient than burning raw wood. The charcoal burned hotter and longer than wood, extracting more useful heat from the same starting material. The labor savings were substantial. Cutting 5 fewer cords of wood meant more time for other activities, trapping, hunting, equipment maintenance, or simply resting. In a survival situation where energy and time are precious resources, this efficiency multiplied a man's chances of making it through the winter healthy and intact. The psychological impact was equally important. The constant stress of fire tending, waking multiple times per night, worrying about running out of wood, all of that took a mental and emotional toll. Men became exhausted not just physically but mentally. Samuel's system allowed for full nights of sleep, which meant better decision-making, better mood, and better overall resilience. In survival situations, mental state is as important as physical resources. The spread of the coal bed system beyond the Bitterroot Valley was gradual but steady. Robert Fraser, the Scottish trapper who had visited in March, kept his promise. He shared the design with trappers throughout the northern Rockies and into Canada. He wrote detailed descriptions in letters to trading posts and included sketches in his journals. By 1840, versions of the coal bed system were in use from Montana to British Columbia. Each region adapted it to local conditions and materials. In areas with plentiful clay, people built adobe thermal masses instead of using stone. In regions with different wood types, they adjusted the charcoal production methods. Coastal trappers sometimes used dried seaweed mixed into the charcoal for longer burn times. The core principle remained the same, but the implementation varied based on what was available and what worked best in each specific environment. This adaptability was part of the system's genius. It wasn't a rigid design that only worked in one way. It was a set of principles that could be applied flexibly. Heat a thermal mass. Use it to radiate warmth over extended periods. Vent safely. Insulate properly. These principles could be implemented with various materials and configurations. The knowledge also moved beyond the trapping community. Settlers building homesteads in the mountain territories learned about coal beds from trappers. Mining camps adopted versions of the system for bunkhouses. Remote logging camps built communal warming platforms based on the same principles. Even some Native American groups, who already had sophisticated heating methods, incorporated elements of the coal bed design into their winter dwellings. Knowledge doesn't stay confined. It flows through communities, across cultures, and evolves as different people add their own innovations. Samuel's original design was just a starting point. Within 20 years, there were dozens of variations, each adapted to specific needs and circumstances. One particularly interesting adaptation came from a group of miners in Idaho Territory around 1852. They built a scaled-up version of the coal bed system to heat their entire bunkhouse. Instead of individual bed platforms, they created a raised floor for the whole building with a large thermal mass beneath it. The entire floor radiated warmth. A single stoking of the coal system could keep the bunkhouse comfortable for 16 to 18 hours. This allowed the miners to work their full shifts, return to a warm building, and sleep without anyone needing to tend fires through the night. The labor efficiency gain was so significant that the mine owner documented the system and recommended it for other mining operations. This documentation, preserved in company records, is one of the few written accounts of the coal bed system's spread and evolution. The dangers of the system were real and need to be acknowledged. Improperly vented coal beds killed people through carbon monoxide poisoning. Poorly constructed thermal masses sometimes cracked from thermal stress, causing fires. Overzealous loading of coals created excessive heat that damaged structures or burned sleepers. A few deaths and several serious injuries were attributed to coal bed systems over the years. However, these dangers were almost always the result of cutting corners or ignoring safety principles. A properly built system, following Samuel's design principles, was remarkably safe. The key was understanding that every element mattered. You couldn't skip the venting to save effort. You couldn't use flammable materials in the thermal mass to make construction easier. You couldn't ignore the insulation layers because they seemed excessive. Every safety feature was there for a reason, often learned through someone else's mistake. Samuel himself trained people to be cautious. He emphasized the dangers of carbon monoxide repeatedly. He insisted on proper venting, showing people how to test their vents to ensure they were drawing correctly. He taught them to place a candle near the coal bed access door. If the candle flame was pulled toward the door, it meant the vent was creating proper draft. If the flame wasn't affected, the vent was blocked or inadequate and needed to be fixed before using the system. He also taught people to never seal their cabins completely. Even with perfect venting, a small amount of fresh air circulation was important. A tiny gap under the door, a small vent hole near the ceiling, something to ensure the cabin wasn't completely airtight. This simple precaution prevented many potential problems. The economic impact of the coal bed system extended beyond individual survival. Trading posts in regions where the system was widely used noticed a change in the pattern of goods purchased. Trappers were buying less firewood cutting equipment and more charcoal-making supplies. They were spending less time on survival basics and more time on productive activities like trapping and hunting, which meant more furs coming into the trading posts. The overall economic productivity of trappers using the coal bed system was measurably higher. They caught more furs because they had more time and energy to devote to trapping. They were healthier and less exhausted, so they worked more efficiently. The survival rate improved, meaning more trappers stayed in the profession rather than dying or giving up and leaving. In a purely economic sense, the coal bed system made the fur trade more sustainable and profitable. Trading post managers, who were often the unofficial historians and record keepers of frontier regions, noted these changes. Some of their journals and account books survived and provide fascinating glimpses into how a simple heating innovation rippled through an entire economic system. The environmental impact, though not discussed in these terms at the time, was also significant. A trapper using a coal bed system cut dramatically less wood than one using traditional heating. In heavily trapped areas where multiple trappers were operating relatively close together, the reduced deforestation was noticeable. Forests near trapping camps lasted longer. The visible damage of clear-cut areas for firewood was reduced. This wasn't environmental consciousness in any modern sense. It was simple resource management. Less wood needed meant resources lasted longer. But the effect was real. The coal bed system was more environmentally sustainable than traditional methods, even though no one was thinking in those terms. This sustainability meant trappers could stay in one area longer before resource depletion forced them to move. It reduced the pressure on local ecosystems. Again, these weren't the reasons people adopted the system, but they were beneficial side effects. By the late 1850s, the coal bed system was common enough in mountain regions that it stopped being remarkable. It was just how things were done. New trappers learned to build coal beds as part of their basic training. Experienced trappers had refined versions in their permanent winter quarters. The knowledge had transitioned from innovation to tradition. This transition is how good ideas survive across generations. They stop being that new thing and become how we've always done it, even though always might only be 20 years. The knowledge becomes embedded in the culture, passed from experienced people to newcomers as established practice. Samuel Whitmore's role in this was largely forgotten. By the 1860s, most people using coal beds had no idea who'd invented the system or how it had spread. It was just the mountain man way of heating a bed. The specific origins were lost to the general knowledge pool. Samuel himself never sought credit or recognition. He'd solved a problem, shared the solution, and moved on with his life. The system worked. People survived. That was enough for him. This attitude, humble and practical, was characteristic of many frontier innovators. They weren't seeking fame or profit. They were solving immediate problems. If the solution helped others, excellent. If it spread and evolved, even better. The reward was survival and community improvement, not personal glory. The decline of the coal bed system began in the late 1800s as the frontier closed and technology advanced. Manufactured cast iron stoves became widely available and affordable. These stoves were more convenient than coal beds, easier to install, and didn't require the labor-intensive process of charcoal making. By 1900, the coal bed system was becoming rare, used primarily by old-timers in very remote locations. The knowledge began to fade. Younger generations moving into the mountains used modern heating and never learned the old techniques. By 1920, the coal bed system was almost completely forgotten, surviving only in a few written accounts and the memories of very old men who'd used it in their youth. This pattern of knowledge loss is common throughout history. When a new technology replaces an old technique, the old knowledge often disappears entirely within a generation or two. Unless someone makes a deliberate effort to preserve it, the practical details are lost. We're left with vague historical references to old heating methods without understanding how they actually worked. In recent decades, there's been renewed interest in traditional heating systems. People interested in off-grid living, sustainable housing, and historical technology have rediscovered the coal bed principle. Modern versions use electric heating elements or hot water pipes instead of charcoal. But the core idea, heat a thermal mass that radiates warmth over extended periods, is the same. Engineers have validated what Samuel Whitmore understood intuitively. Thermal mass heating is extremely efficient. It decouples heat production from heat delivery, allowing you to burn fuel at its most efficient rate and store the resulting energy for a gradual release. This matches the variable demand of heating, high production when convenient, steady delivery when needed, better than constant combustion systems. Modern radiant floor heating is essentially a high-tech version of Samuel's coal bed. The principles are identical. Heat a mass beneath the living surface. Let it radiate warmth upward. Enjoy consistent, comfortable heat without constant fuel consumption. The technology has improved, but the concept is 180 years old, invented by a Pennsylvania blacksmith in a Montana cabin. The story of Samuel Whitmore's coal bed is ultimately about the nature of innovation. Real innovation isn't always about inventing something entirely new. Often it's about combining existing knowledge in new ways or applying known principles to new problems. Samuel didn't invent thermal mass storage. He didn't invent charcoal. He didn't invent venting systems. He combined these existing elements to solve a specific problem in a specific context. That combination was his innovation. The mockery he faced was also typical of genuine innovation. People are suspicious of new approaches, especially when traditional methods seem adequate. The person proposing change is viewed as foolish, wasteful, or dangerous until the moment their innovation proves itself. Then suddenly, everyone wants to adopt it, and the initial skepticism is conveniently forgotten. Samuel's response to mockery, ignore it, and build anyway, is the right approach for innovators. Don't waste energy arguing. Build your solution. Prove it works. Help others who are interested. Let the results speak. The doubters will either come around or they won't. But either way, you've solved the problem for yourself and anyone willing to listen. The seasonal timing of Samuel's project is also significant. He built his system in late summer and autumn, when others were focused on traditional preparations. This seems like poor planning until you realize he was preparing differently, investing time in infrastructure that would pay off all winter long. Sometimes the best preparation isn't doing what everyone else is doing. It's thinking ahead to what will actually matter when conditions become extreme. The Christmas storm that killed 3 trappers was a harsh teacher. It demonstrated that adequate preparation isn't enough. You need excellent preparation. You need systems that work not just in typical conditions, but in worst-case conditions. Because worst-case conditions happen. Not every year, but eventually. And when they do, the difference between adequate and excellent is the difference between survival and death. This lesson applies far beyond 1830s Montana. Modern life insulates us from many natural dangers, but it creates new vulnerabilities, power outages, supply chain disruptions, economic instability, medical emergencies. The principle remains the same. Prepare for the worst case, not the average case. Build systems with margins of safety. Don't assume that what worked last year will work next year. Samuel's willingness to help others, even those who'd mocked him, reflects an important survival principle. In harsh environments, community strength matters more than individual advantage. A valley full of trappers with good heating systems was safer for everyone than a valley where only Samuel had figured it out. Shared knowledge and mutual aid were survival strategies, not just moral positions. The evolution of the coal bed system after Samuel's original design shows how knowledge improves through diverse contributions. Different people in different situations found different improvements. The cumulative result was better than any single person could have achieved alone. This is how human knowledge advances, not through lone geniuses working in isolation, but through sharing ideas, building on each other's work, and collectively solving problems. The economic impacts of survival innovations are often overlooked. The coal bed system saved time and labor. That translated directly into economic productivity. People could do more valuable work because they spent less time on basic survival. This multiplication effect meant the innovation had impacts far beyond its immediate function. The knowledge loss that occurred as the frontier closed is a cautionary tale. When we stop using old techniques, we often lose the detailed understanding of how they worked. This makes us dependent on current technology. If that technology fails or becomes unavailable, we've lost the ability to fall back on proven alternatives. Some knowledge is worth preserving even when we don't currently need it, because we might need it again someday. The modern rediscovery of thermal mass heating principles validates Samuel's work. His intuitive understanding was correct. The system he built was genuinely superior to traditional methods for specific applications. Modern engineers, with all their training and tools, have arrived at the same conclusions he reached through observation and experimentation. The final lesson from Samuel's coal bed is about persistence in the face of doubt. He had every reason to give up on his project. He was sick, exhausted from digging, mocked by neighbors, and working on something unproven. But he believed in his reasoning. He trusted his knowledge of heat and materials. He persisted through the mockery and the work, and he was right. Sometimes the path forward requires ignoring the crowd, trusting your own judgment, and doing the work even when others call you a fool. Samuel Whitmore didn't set out to revolutionize heating technology. He just wanted to survive the winter without freezing. But his solution to that personal problem ended up helping countless others. It saved lives. It improved quality of life for an entire generation of mountain dwellers. It demonstrated principles that remain valid today. That Pennsylvania blacksmith, who came west to die from tuberculosis, instead lived another 30 years and left a legacy of practical wisdom that outlasted him by decades. The cabin is gone. The man is forgotten by most. But the knowledge survived, rediscovered by each generation that needs it. And that ultimately is the victory. Not personal glory, but useful knowledge that helps people survive and thrive in challenging conditions. That's the real measure of success for any innovation. Everyone mocked his carbon coal bed until he slept 50 degrees warmer and survived and helped others survive and proved that sometimes the fool is the only wise man in the room.